This video has been made with the purpose of education and awareness of real crimes, and there is no disrespect intended to anyone. This is to help promote truth and justice for anyone who has been a victim of crime. What I'm about to report is what I have researched online, and I will welcome any corrections should they be required. Hello Eriberry True Crime fans, it's Eriberry here, standing desk today. I really could not face sitting in my chair for hours. Today, it's a little bit different. It is going to look different at some point because I'm actually going to redecorate this area soon, put some artwork up and bits and pieces. But I hope you enjoy this one. This is another unsolved case. This just makes me absolutely mad, this case. This is the case of the Jamison family. On the 8th of October 2009, Sherilynn, Bobby, their daughter Madyson and dog Maisie left their home in Eufaula, Oklahoma in their pickup truck because they were planning to potentially purchase a 40-acre plot of land so that they could live off the grid and start a new life. This was the last time the family was seen alive. Sherilynn and Bobby met in 2002, married about 2 years later, and very shortly they had a daughter, Madyson Stormy Star. I absolutely love that name. Sherilynn had a son, Colton, from a previous marriage, and he was 12 years old at the time of this incident. About 6 months before the Jamisons went missing, Colton was living with them. He had been living with them for quite a large part of his life. However, something started to happen that made him feel quite uncomfortable at home. Sherilynn was a devoted mother. She was devoted to her son, to her daughter. She was just generally a really kind, loving person, but she did have a fair amount of issues. She was diagnosed with bipolar disorder. Certain episodes of being extremely depressed or extremely manic were really taking their toll on Colton. So he decided he wanted to go away and live with his father. Bobby, some years before the incident, had been involved in a horrific car accident that left him with debilitating back pain to the point that he couldn't work anymore. These injuries were so bad that even though it happened in 2003, 6 years later, he was still suffering very, very badly. He took very, very strong pain medication for it. Physically, he couldn't do a lot of labour and work, so they were living off benefits, essentially. They did have a lakeside property, and Madyson, for all intents and purposes, was a very happy, well-looked-after young girl. But around a few months before this, probably around the time Colton went to live with his father, Madyson was actually pulled out of school so the Jamisons could start to homeschool her. The financial stress really took its toll on the couple. I mean, Sherilynn was already battling bipolar, but she also neglected to take her medication sometimes, or at least she didn't take them regularly or in the right amount. So with bipolar disorder or any kind of depressive disorder, it is very, very important to get the right medication for that person's brain chemistry and make sure it's taken at specific times and specific dosages. And if it isn't, that can cause an imbalance, and it's very, very hard to recover from that. Friends and family of the Jamisons were also quite worried about them. They reportedly said that their house was haunted. Bobby had actually gone to his local pastor and asked if he could purchase, quote, special bullets to destroy evil spirits that he believed were lurking around their house. Sherilynn also had an interest in witchcraft. She had also written on a storage container, a red storage container that they had at their property. She'd spray painted graffiti on it saying, "Witches don't like their black cats killed," or to that effect. This is because some of her cats had unfortunately died, and she believed that the neighbours were poisoning them, although she couldn't prove that. There were problems in the Jamisons' marriage like there usually are in most marriages. Even the ones that stand the test of time do run into problems. It's a roller coaster. It's not plain sailing. It is completely understandable that they were experiencing a lot of stress, a lot of anxiety, because Bobby couldn't go out and do a lot of stuff. He was in the house all the time. It could be that because Sherilynn had unfortunately episodes of severe depression and was not very good at taking her medication the right amounts at the right times, that this is possibly why they believe their home to be haunted. Some friends and family that would come and visit them actually said themselves they believed that the house was haunted. Not that that adds any more credence to it, but there was Definitely some strange atmosphere going on. In addition to asking about special bullets, Bobby had actually purchased a satanic Bible because he was thinking of performing an exorcism himself at the property. Whether or not he actually went through with that, I don't know. To their neighbourhood, friends, family, the Jamisons were actually known as a very nice, quiet couple, but rather reclusive. They kind of kept to themselves. If Sherilynn was not well mentally and Bobby couldn't go out and do a lot physically, it's understandable that they would want to stay inside, or at least try and do things that were not too strenuous, but it would have been very, very stressful. It seems that for quite some time they were thinking of potentially just relocating somewhere, living off the grid, disappearing almost, and going off and living in the storage container that they kept at their property, turning it potentially into a tiny home. Who knows? But they wanted to just be more reclusive than they actually were. So on the 8th of October, they loaded some things into their pickup truck and took off, presumably to speak to somebody about purchasing a 40-acre plot of land. It's obvious that this was not intended to be the time that they actually left and moved out, because of course they didn't take everything with them. The storage container was there, they would have to come back and get it. After a few days, the Jamisons hadn't returned and hadn't contacted anybody. Friends and family were trying to contact them on their cell phones, but the cell phones were actually dead. Now, if you're going to go somewhere into the back of beyond, into the middle of nowhere, there's not going to be a lot of cell service. But this seemed very strange. They would have at least come back, told somebody where they were, made arrangements or anything at all, but nothing. There was absolutely nothing. The police were called and they received a lead very, very quickly. South of a town called Kinta, Latimer County, Oklahoma, some hunters found an abandoned truck facing southward on a dirt road that was leading off of a, stone or chalk plateau. This was the Jamisons' truck, but there was no sign of the family. If you look at this area on Google Maps, there are many, many plateaus around. These are abandoned oil wells where people would work to obviously extract oil, but they were abandoned and there were big open clearings. People would often go there and have little parties or barbecues or whichever, but they were pretty much in a remote area. This was halfway up a mountain. When the hunters found the truck, they had a look inside and it turned out not all of the family was missing. Inside was Maisie the dog. She'd been locked in there for however long. She was dehydrated, starving, and probably very short on oxygen as well, so the hunters broke the window open to rescue her. This is where the case gets really, really bizarre. Now, I've got my notes here and I'm going to have to refer to them, so I apologise if I keep looking down, but I've written everything down here. There's so much to remember. The truck was locked, windows up, and the keys were locked inside the car. All of the family's personal belongings, like their clothes, everything they took with them, including their cell phones, the GPS equipment, wallets with cash and IDs, were still inside as well. Only 2 items have not been found. Now, there's reason to believe that there was a brown suitcase, backpack, satchel, whatever you want to call it, like a brown container of some sort, and a pistol that belonged to Sherilynn was missing. There were a few other things that were kind of bizarre that were found in the car as well. There was an 11-page letter or diary entry that Sherilynn had apparently written to Bobby, and she was absolutely ranting at him. I will get into the subject of that a little bit later because that in itself is kind of bizarre. There were no signs whatsoever of any kind of struggle, any kind of altercation, no physical damage evidence, like no blood or scuff marks. Even around the area where it was found, there was no evidence that a fight had taken place. Nothing. It seems that the Jamisons had parked the car there, locked the dog in the car, and just walked away, if they walked away. It was impossible to say. It had been about 8 days, and Maisie had probably been in there for only a few days. She wouldn't have been able to survive 8 days in that car. So it probably would have been about 5 days at most. But either way, This was becoming extremely strange. The only sign of damage to the car was the broken window that the hunters had to do in order to get to Maisie, otherwise she would have died before the police had got there, most likely. There were also no mechanical faults with the car. It wasn't out of gas. It just seemed very strange that the car had been abandoned. Usually you abandon your car in a place in the middle of nowhere if your car won't start, if you're out of gas, and there's no way of getting it, and there's no one around that can help. That's when you'd abandon the car, but wouldn't they take their dog with them? Maisie and Madyson were inseparable. Maisie was Madyson's best friend in the world. This little girl adored that dog, and she would never have gone anywhere. And even Bobby's mother has said this, that she never would have gone anywhere without Maisie. If at any time they left Maisie in the car and gone away with Madyson, she would not have had it. Thankfully, she was nursed back to health and went to live with Bobby's mother, with whom I believe she still lives. However, the strangest thing, very, very strange, and I cannot believe this, is under the car seat, under the tools under the car seat, so really, really far down, very, very much concealed, and would have only been accessible through a forensic search, which of course the police carried out, was $32,000 in cash in a bag. How on earth were a family on benefits able to accumulate this much cash? Some resources I've read say that the Jamisons didn't actually trust banks, or they like to keep cash around as opposed to depositing it. Now, that in a way I can understand. Now, I don't quite understand how the benefit system works in America, but I assume it's a bit like in this country, if you've got working tax credits or whichever, that your bank accounts are actually monitored, and if you have excessive amounts of cash in there, they either stop or reduce your benefits. So say for example, someone who sells their car, they often will ask for cash as opposed to a bank transfer, because the benefits will see that and reduce everything, so they don't actually gain anything from selling a car, if you know what I mean. Cadaver dogs and blood dogs were deployed to see if they could trace anything, and they also used tracker dogs to track the scent of the Jamisons, which was actually tracked to a place called Smokestack Hollow, where there were some water towers. But there was no sign of them at the water towers, or sign that they were ever there. Not even in the water towers. Everything was searched. They weren't there. The police then focused on the Jamisons' home. They searched it high and low, found multiple books on witchcraft, on Satanism, on exorcisms. There, of course, was the allegations of it being haunted, for example, but some friends and family also believed it to be haunted, but others believed it to be just hypochondria or attention seeking or whichever. This isn't something that the police would focus on. They would focus on things for which there was actual evidence. And what they found was actually, if anything, a lack of evidence. There was no evidence whatsoever that said, why on earth did the Jamisons just leave their car, supposedly heading downwards from the plateau? Some people said it was halfway down the road, but actually, if you look at the pictures, in the background you can see an embankment. It looked like they were just heading out when they exited their car and then just disappeared. There was one other thing that the police were interested in, which was a lodger that they once had at the house, who Sherilynn once had to chase out of the house at gunpoint, because this man was actually a white supremacist, and Sherilynn had Native American ancestry. She was very proud of it. She had no reason at all to ever be ashamed of it, and she quite openly said, yes, I'm Native American and I'm proud of it. Why ever not? But this lodger pretty much said to her that she should be killed. So she went and got her gun and told him to leave the home, which he did, and he did not return. At the time of the incident, this man was actually in prison, so he couldn't have directly at least committed this murder. Could it have been a contract killing? Could it have been a contract anything? Because nobody knew if they were actually dead. They were still missing. The police had to examine everything, so they examined the cell phones as well as the GPS equipment. And what it actually showed was that the Jamisons had driven up this road. They had at some point got out and hiked not far, just a few hundred meters up the mountainside. Now let's not forget that Bobby wouldn't have been able to hike for very long. And there was a photograph taken of Madyson near a rock formation. Now, a lot has been made about this photograph, that she looks scared, this isn't her normal smile, she normally would be looking at the camera, and this just seemed very bizarre. When I look at this photograph, it looks like it was taken mid-conversation. It looks like she was talking to either one of the parents while the other one took a photo, or she was looking at something or calling to her dog, and it was snapped at a moment when she wasn't aware that she was going to be photographed. The police were actually able to find the route that the Jamisons took to this formation because the GPS was taken with them. Undoubtedly, they would have taken Maisie. It's unlikely they would have left her in the car, particularly with a dog. You know, they quite frequently need to go to the bathroom, so this would have been a good idea for her to do. That photograph is the last activity on those cell phones. They did actually find footprints of shoes around about the size that Madyson would actually wear. There was one more discovery made, which was not actually at the scene, but at the home, and this was the CCTV footage which depicted the multiple trips to the car that the Jamisons made the day they departed their home. Some of the footage is available online. Other YouTubers have covered it, such as mystery channels, for example, but this footage, it doesn't flow. It's very grainy, and it's every second or so a frame is taken. I have read in some sources that what we can see online is not exactly what the CCTV footage showed. Whether or not it did actually flow, or it was one of those cameras that did take a photograph every second or every half a second or something like that, whether it had audio or not, you know, you can't actually even make out their facial features, let alone if they're saying anything or smiling or anything like that. One of the psychologists actually reviewed this footage and said to the sheriff in charge of the case that they were on drugs. Much has been made about the Jamisons potentially being into methamphetamine. Now, that's baseless. There was no evidence whatsoever of any illegal drug ever found at the house, let alone methamphetamine. And even though the Jamisons were on prescription medication, and there were prescription medications found in the car and at the home, there was no sign that even this medication was being abused. It may well have been. But if the psychologist is using that jumpy, grainy footage by which to determine that, which only shows outside of the home, it doesn't actually show them actually entering the home, I don't quite understand how they can make that determination. Now, I'm not the only YouTuber that thinks that this footage has been made up to be something that it isn't. When they're going to and from the car, they are changing clothes several times, they are taking things to the truck and then bringing them back. Now, it's not easy to identify exactly what they're taking to the car. So when they were taking an itinerary of what was actually found in the car versus what they saw when the Jamisons left the car, they are able to account for everything apart from that brown satchel or suitcase. They don't know if the pistol was inside that brown satchel or suitcase or inside something else, or if it indeed was taken. But that pistol, Sherilynn's pistol, has never ever been recovered. Their behaviour was seen as very zombie-like, and apparently they never once interacted with each other. They never once spoke to each other, never once gestured to each other or touched one another or passed anything to one another. They've been described as being in a trance. Let's not forget that the medication that Sherilynn and Bobby were on could well have altered their state of mind, but surely this wouldn't have been the first time they would have been taking medication, because they had been for years. They were also lucid enough to be able to make several trips to and from the car and drive up to, a mountainside. My wife and I have done this several times when we've had to load up the car to either take stuff to the dump or move things, we're moving house but also helping other people move. We have to make numerous trips, and sometimes if you're not sure what you want to take with you, like if you're going on holiday or whatever, you will take things there and go, do you know what, I don't want to take that, or maybe. It's possible that they just didn't plan this at all. They didn't make an itinerary of what they would need. This was not going to be the last time they would be at their home in Eufaula. They were going to come back, so they were probably very picky about what they would take with them and what they would probably wear. What would the weather be like? What sort of things would they need to wear? It's also not clear from that footage whether they did just say one word or two to one another, and it could be that they were arguing that day and didn't want to talk to each other. That's probably why they made so many trips, because there wasn't a lot of communication, but that could be just because they were not in a good mood with one another. That doesn't mean that they were on drugs. One word or an eye gesture or a, oh, you know, I'm going to do this and that, wouldn't have been discernible from at least the footage that I've seen or that is available to us on YouTube or on the internet. If you're packing things, you're going to be busy with your hands. You're not going to be, you know, hugging your partner or patting them on the back, or you're not going to be sort of like pointing here and there. You're just going to be doing your own thing, really, especially if you're at that point where you're maybe having an argument with your partner and you don't want to talk to each other. That's possibly what it could have been. It seems this was a case of they were packing on the spur of the moment. They hadn't thought it through, were changing their minds every so often, saw that some clothes were dirty and didn't want to take them with them. That is quite possible, but then I am putting my own personal opinion on this, but this is simply because it doesn't seem to be, it doesn't seem to shed light on exactly what happened to them 30 miles away. The amount of money they had with them as well makes sense if they wanted to buy a plot of land off the grid with no chain, no trace, because cash is very hard to trace. So that was understandable, but how on earth had they accumulated that much in cash? There was speculation that even though the Jamisons themselves were not drug addicts, they potentially had ties to drug rings or criminal network, which is how they were able to accumulate the money, and this was how they were able to accumulate the money in a short space of time. Or, you know, they may have been saving up for years. They did this literally just to make enough money to go off the grid, or they wanted to go off the grid because potentially they owed drug dealers money, or potentially they got into things that they shouldn't have done, and this is maybe another reason why they took Madyson out of school. They were potentially scared for her safety. There was actually a family member or a friend, I couldn't find out who this was, if you can please let me know, who actually asked Sherilynn about certain money-making schemes, and she said she didn't want to say what it was because it was very dodgy. The state of the Jamisons' marriage was also a focal point of this investigation. People quite commonly said that they were arguments. It's understandable that there was stress going on, and the police focused a lot on this apparent 11-page letter, whether it was a letter intended to be delivered to Bobby, something he'd ever read. Some sources have said that the 11 pages where all these quotes came from were purely found in the car. Some of them say some were in the car, some say they were at home, but in this letter and in these diary entries, she really lets Bobby have it. She tells him exactly what she thinks of him, in the sense that she feels he's a dangerous person, how lazy he was becoming a hermit. Remember, he said he couldn't go out much. She even accused him of wishing her dead. There was one thing that she said in her letter which did concern the police. She was very concerned that Bobby would kill her, which would mean that Madyson would end up in foster care. Sherilynn's mother and other people have said something which I kind of understand, which is, I mean, as a writer myself, I used to write diary entries and I used to write things down that I wanted to get out of myself, but you know, really, really emotive stuff. So I would just write it down. And if you're really that angry at somebody, if you're really feeling that way about somebody, rather than tell them to their face, you write it down, just so you can let it out. Sherilynn, unfortunately, she did have quite a lot of dark thoughts, and this was her way of getting them out of herself. So she was journaling. This is a kind of therapy where it's like counselling. When you're talking to somebody, you're letting someone else, even if it's a piece of paper, which you can imagine you're writing to somebody, you're letting that person, or either directly or indirectly, know how you feel. This eviscerating letter or diary entry, it may not be as malignant as it sounds. It may be completely benign. Writing things down and either keeping them for yourself or destroying it afterwards is a healthy way of getting your feelings out without directly hurting anybody, especially if you're someone who's maybe even a fiction writer, there could be something that is bugging you, but you can't just write it down and it's fine. Sometimes writers will work it into a story or use it as inspiration for something, because it is a form of therapy. Sherilyn's mother says she doesn't believe that Sherilyn meant everything that she wrote, that, you know, the family hadn't split up. They were planning on a new start. They were planning to, you know, to live together on a plot of land with Madyson. They were planning to spend their time together away from society. So that, to me, doesn't seem that their marriage was in a terrible state. It wasn't in a great state, but it doesn't seem to have been in a terrible state. But the Jamisons were still missing. There was, and I mean an extensive search, at least 1,000 people comprising of volunteers as well as the police force, people on horseback with dogs, hunters, all over that area. The whole place was scoured for months. They did eventually have to scale it back because there was no sign whatsoever. But what also was strange was that we know that Bobby wasn't very able-bodied enough to be able to manage these kinds of terrains, these rocky, hilly terrains. They probably would have left in another vehicle or by other means. Even if Bobby had help or was forced, for example, he wouldn't have been able to walk very far. Just over 4 years after the disappearance, a couple called Graham and Shari were hiking up a mountain that they often did every year. They were hunting for deer. When Graham was around about halfway up a mountain near Kinter, just south of Kinter, when he saw something which he said looked a little bit like the shimmer or shine that you will see on a tree when a deer sharpens its antlers, or at least marks a tree, and it scrapes off the bark to the point that it buffs it into a shine. But this was on the floor, which was a bit strange. He walked over to it, moved it with his foot, and what he saw as it rotated was an eye socket. It was a human skull. He then saw there were more bones sticking out of the ground. He called to his wife. They turned to run down the hill. They were freaked out. As they were descending, Shari found another human skeleton. Some items of clothing were found with the skeletons, although it was very scarce. It seemed to be not complete skeletons, and it's not known precisely where the bodies were found. It was either in Haskell County or Latimer County, or on the borderline between the two, but it turned out they were in Latimer County, approximately 75 yards or 68 meters from the nearest road. This was 3.5 miles from where the Jamisons' truck was found. If these skeletons were indeed the Jamisons, or anyone else for that matter, the smell of decomposing flesh is extremely pungent, and for a body to go from being, you know, from just dead to skeletal does take quite some time, even if you're in the kind of forest area where there are lots of animals, etc. Somebody would have found something, and Graham and Shari actually made annual visits to these mountains. Of course, the police were called, and Graham and Shari were not actually allowed to leave pretty much for the next 12 hours. They underwent extensive questioning about how they found them, etc. The skeletons were eventually retrieved, and it was noted that there were 3 bodies, 2 adults and 1 child. It took a long time, it took months of DNA testing, but eventually they were confirmed as being those of the Jamisons. Google Earth, approximately 2008. Exact location of the bodies are not 100% confirmed, but the rough area has been identified. One Reddit user pointed out that the bodies were found quite far up a steep slope, so it is unlikely that they ended up there from a flood. It is possible that the bodies were at or near the summit, but it is unlikely as this area was extensively searched by volunteers. Police on foot as well as horseback and the cadaver dogs did not track their scent there. The family was discovered 4 years after they disappeared, making it unlikely that the Jamisons ended up in this location shortly after they vanished. Also, I mention again that Bobby suffered from debilitating back pain. How on earth would he have been able to walk that far, if indeed that was the place at which they died? A cause of death could not be determined due to the state of the bodies. However, they did find on the back of Bobby's skull there was a hole which they did feel could potentially have been a bullet wound. but it could also have been from animal activity, so it's never been determined as to what that actually was. Assuming that they were there all along, say just a day or two after they went missing, that's where they died, that's where they stayed. How on earth were they not found again? The smell of a decomposing corpse, especially a human corpse, is absolutely nauseating. It would have been overpowering. They may well have gone somewhere else and then gone there and then been killed, or been killed somewhere else, kept somewhere for a while and then moved. Both Sherilynn and Bobby's mothers do believe that the Jamisons met with foul play. Bobby's mother, Star, has actually said something very interesting, that the family saw something they weren't meant to see. The GPS footage shows that after parking their car on the plateau, the Jamisons did hike halfway up the mountain. They also did come back to the truck. That was at least determined. There was also something very odd on the plateau. There was a blue truck which looked like it had been burnt out, or at least, almost attempted to be demolished, just sitting there on the plateau. It had been vandalised as well, with graffiti all over it, which had been done before it had been burnt out. Police examined the graffiti and compared it to the graffiti that Sherilynn had put onto the storage container and found them to be pretty much a match. They are sure that Sherilynn hit this truck because she would often do that with other vehicles. She would write things about the devil or something to do with witchcraft. With spray painting writing, you don't normally use your normal cursive. Many people write in capitals, and it's not the same as freehand, but at least they would be able to see similarities in curvature of the letters. So if the police have conducted, or at least consulted professionals who have conducted analysis of the writing on the truck, let's not forget some of the wording probably wouldn't have been discernible because the metal had bowed. It's possible that Sherilynn had actually done this. In addition to the lodger, who was actually found to have been incarcerated at the time, there was one other suspect. Bobby's father, Bobby Sr. I'm going to refer to them as Junior and Senior, just so we know who we're talking about. Bobby Jr. and Bobby Sr. did not have a good relationship, which is putting it mildly. Junior had actually taken out a protective order against Senior. Junior says that his father had threatened to have him killed and was allegedly involved with drug cartels, had ties to very dangerous people. This was literally only a few months before the Jamisons went missing. Senior died only a few months after the Jamisons went missing, so he cannot be questioned any more than he may have been already. Even if he were responsible, he can't receive a fair hearing, so we can't assume that he was behind this. He very likely had connections to very bad people. He wouldn't hesitate to murder somebody probably if he threatened to have his own son killed, and usually many people who are involved in drug cartels are not above eliminating people who they believe may blow their cover or may snitch on them. Coupled with the fact that the Jamisons didn't only want to relocate, but they wanted to completely disappear. Not in the way they actually did, but they wanted to go off the grid. They did tell people where they were going. It's possible that they didn't want to be found for that reason. They wanted out if they were involved in any kind of drug cartel. And one thing that really bothers me is that little Madyson died. Criminal networks, drug cartels, mercenaries, I hate to say it, but they're not above killing children. A child of 6 is, for all intents and purposes, innocent. Their brains are not fully developed, but if they see something, they may say something. A murder-suicide was also suspected, but this seemed kind of implausible because if one of them wanted to kill the others, wouldn't they have chosen a better place to do it? And also, Bobby would not have been able to walk those 3 miles over rough terrain or to smokestack. There was no murder weapon found with the bodies at all. It was all dug up. There was nothing found there whatsoever. Sherilynn's gun, as I've said, has never ever been found, either at the house, at the scene where the car was found, or around that area. It was never found near where their bodies were located. That gun has disappeared into the ethers. Nobody knows where it is. I have read some resources that said the place they wanted to purchase, it wasn't particularly that plateau, but it was near there. Some sources say they did actually meet with somebody. Some sources say another person saw them walking around, but it's not clear as to what actually happened, because the money was found in the car. It hadn't been handed over. The location is extremely remote. Now, unless the truck had a tracking device, I mean, it had GPS, but would someone be able to follow them there? And if they were followed there, wouldn't they be able to find a better place? Or why follow them all the way there? One thing I can't get out of my head is, what if they were lured there on the pretense of buying property only to be met with people who wanted them dead? Or they were told, you need to drive to this location on the pretense of buying property, tell people that's what you're doing, but you need to come here, otherwise your family's going to be in danger. They probably took Madyson and Maisie just so it didn't look too suspicious, or they were told they had to bring everyone. But why would they want to bring the dog? You know, they could have left the dog with Sherilynn's mother, with Bobby's mother, whoever. Let's not forget Maisie's life was spared. But of course, a dog isn't going to go blabbing to the police about what they've seen. A drug cartel isn't going to bother killing an animal. They're not above it. But why would they waste bullets or draw attention to, you know, like a gunfire, for example, where people, even though it's a remote area, could potentially have heard it? Would they have left evidence of a bullet? Would they have made it obvious that this was a crime? It's possible that the Jamisons did leave to genuinely go and see about an actual area of land, and after they hiked up the mountain, because let's not forget they parked the car, whether they parked in the actual location where it was found is unknown. They hiked up the mountain a little bit and then came back down. I don't know whether or not driving up there, because it's a one-way exit, they would have driven up, turned the car around and then parked it so it was pointing downwards, so when they came back down they wouldn't have had to have driven around again. But then what's the point? It was a big area, they could easily have turned around. Or they just left it there, hiked up the mountain, came down, put everything in the car, turned it around and then were stopped. Or something stopped them. There was another thing that struck me about the location. Criminal gangs, drug cartels, people doing shady deals, they need to find places where there aren't a lot of ears listening, a lot of tongues waggling, a lot of eyes seeing, so they will probably choose places like this to carry out some illegal activities. This area was a popular picnic area, but it was not like a big park where there'd be kids running around all over the place. It's very unlikely anyone would be there at all. So it's probably that the Jamisons were just in the wrong place at the wrong time. The Jamisons may have witnessed something. They may have known something and were tracked down or followed or lured. They knew something that got them in trouble. They could have been simply it may likely have been when they were coming down from the mountain, because they wouldn't have gone very far. And then they probably tried to make a getaway and were blocked. Guns were probably pointing at them to get out of the car, so they got out without fuss. And they probably left Maisie in the car because the people there probably wouldn't have seen it, because she was a very small dog, so they would have just said everyone out of the car. Now, the brown satchel or suitcase may have had the gun in it. Sherilynn, quite potentially, could have taken, it could have been like a purse or something she had on her person, and the gun may have been in there. She may have pointed it at them to try and defend herself, but she was persuaded to put the gun on the floor because they may well have been outnumbered and outgunned. And whoever it was there had taken the gun, and the bag, or whichever, has never been found. But then there were many items of clothing that were also not found, so the bag probably went along with that. The major thing that makes me feel that this was not money motivated was because of the amount of cash that was left in the car. And in addition to that, the wallets were left in the car with cash. There were personal effects in the car. The car itself, it wasn't a beat up car, it was a pretty decent car. That would have been worth a fair bit. That was all evidence of no foul play, because there was no blood, there were no scuff marks, there was no sign of any kind of struggle or bodily injury. The wallets and the cell phone that was taken with them up the mountain, the GPS, were in the car, and locked in the car. And everything was there in plain sight. Now, of course, the money being in a bag, under a car seat, under tools, you're not going to know it's there unless you know it's there. You're not going to actually, believe that this couple has a lot of money on them, or you wouldn't say, have you got any money? Empty your wallets, give us your cards, because cards can be traced. Fingerprints on everything. That's probably another reason why whoever it was who forced the Jamisons out of their car or forced them into another car didn't touch anything. I mean, of course you can wear gloves, but either way, any kind of DNA transfer or fingerprint transfer, it's likely that they were forced, I don't like to use this word, but civilly, without commotion, into another car. And they were either taken somewhere to be questioned as to how much they knew and then killed, given some information and then killed, or they were killed, taken to smokestack, they were going to be left there, and then when all this whole search party and everything, they were moved, which is probably why the cadaver dogs did actually hit on the smokestack, and it wasn't just tracking the scent was tracked there, and cadaver dogs found the scent of death there, but there was no trace of the actual family. They may have been stored somewhere, probably in a freezer, because let's not forget again, a decomposing body is not very pleasant at all, and then they were taken to that location, maybe even up the mountain, and there may have been a flood which dragged them down. Potentially, it's not clear, or animal activity. That may have been what happened to them. It doesn't take very long at all. It takes about an hour and a half-ish, especially in warm weather, for cadaverine, which is the substance which gives the decomposing odour, because bodies actually decompose from the inside out. It's not just bugs from the outside, it's the intestine acids and bacteria that decompose the body. It takes about 90 minutes after death for the scent of cadaverine to be transferred to its area, where they can be detected by cadaver dogs way after the body has been moved. It's extremely potent. This really does, to me, it smacks of foul play. It really does. To lock a car with the keys in the car. Now, whether he had two sets of keys, because when I had a car, I had two sets of keys. He may have locked the car with one set of keys, putting them in there, and they didn't realise there was another set of keys. He may have used that to lock the car, but then whoever it was with them there, forcing them out of the car, would have seen that. But there is a way of locking your car without using the key. You can lift, I don't know if it's the same with American cars, but lifting up the handle of the door and then shutting it with the latch down locks the car. I am moving away from the notion that they were lured there on the pretense of buying land, because whoever had potentially lured them there would have known they would have had cash on them. Now, a lot of criminal networks, they need their income, money is very important to them, more important to them than human life in some cases. Nobody would ever suspect that a family like the Jamisons would have a big bag of money, so nobody would have been looking for it. It wouldn't have been suspicious if that money had have been handed over. It would have been one less thing to worry about, or the Jamisons were told to open their wallets and physically hand over cash, not the cards, because they can be traced, fingerprints or DNA transfer or anything like that. Some have suspected that the Jamisons were actually on their way to make a drug deal themselves, which is why they had so much cash on them. But wouldn't you think that if they were using drugs to make money, they would have stored drugs to sell them to get the cash, unless that had already happened? And that was actually irrelevant to what eventually did happen to them. What happened to the Jamisons when they went missing, how they died, has never ever been determined. It's not just a case of who did it, it's how. If someone did it, was it exposure? Unlikely. Again, how did they get from where the truck was found to where their bodies were found? Let's not forget they were not very far away from one another. They were close to a road. Even if animals had taken them that far, the volunteers would have seen something, smelt something, or whatever. Either way, this mystery is just extremely strange. It's never been solved. If you know anything, if you saw anything, if you know anything whatsoever, please get in contact with the police in Oklahoma. And I really do hope this is solved, because it genuinely is worrying if this can happen to a small family and whoever it is has not been brought to justice. They may well have been through another crime and been found for that, but whether we know who it is, we're never going to know. And if Bobby's father was involved, we don't know. It's so tragic that a whole family was taken out. Not to trivialize it, but it kind of reminds me a bit of Agatha Christie's story called Dumb Witness, where there was a dog who actually witnessed his owner's murder. And of course, being a dumb witness, couldn't say anything. This dog had a trick that he would do, which told Poirot a little bit of information that he needed to know. But unfortunately, Maisie, there's nothing at all. The only thing they can go on is that she was locked in the car with nothing and left. So whoever it was that lured away her family had no use for her. And little Madyson, she was 6 years old. This family, they were looking forward to this new life. I mean, living off the grid or living in a tiny home, if that's what you're going to do, or living off the land sounds amazing. 40 acres is pretty sizable as well. Imagine having all of that for just your family. And they never got that. Absolutely awful. But anyway, thank you very much for watching. And I really do hope you're having a good day wherever you are. And if you know something, or you've seen something or heard something, say something. Get in contact with someone. This case needs to be solved. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.